All right, everybody, welcome back. This is Phil Demetriotis, and we're going to do a lecture here for our environment sketching class. And let's talk about, I want to go over some basics in perspective. Okay, some of you guys in here might have had a perspective class. Some people have not had much at all. And I like to go over a couple basics because perspective to me is one of those areas that a lot of people sort of overlook. And so I want to cover a couple little, simple basics right here for you. And I have some samples that I provided for you, okay? First thing about perspective, okay, what is perspective exactly? It's the art of drawing solid objects on a two-dimensional surface to give the right impression of their height, width, depth, and position in relationship to each other when viewed from a particular point. That point I'm referring to is known as a vantage point. It's known as an angle of view or a viewing point when you're drawing something or you're illustrating an idea for somebody, okay? Perspective is also known as a particular attitude towards or a way of regarding something, a point of view, like we just mentioned, okay? Perspective has a Latin root meaning to look through or to perceive. All the meanings of perspective have something to do with looking and observing, okay? Observing from a viewer, and you're communicating something to somebody else on what you are viewing from a particular angle, okay? All right, and I put a little example here, okay? If you observe from a dog's perspective, you are seeing through the dog's eyes, which means we are displaying the dog's world to the viewer, okay? And drawing perspectives gives you the ability, the appearance of depth or distance. If we say someone has perspective, we mean that, he or she has a sensible outlook on life, right? These are sort of the base definitions that are out there. Here's my definition. This is how an artist or individual perceives a drawing along with the intended emotional impact that is conveyed from the artist to the viewer, okay, which displays a certain point of view or perspective on the subject matter within the art. That is key to me because I mentioned something in there about the emotional impact, okay? That has a huge difference on the way we as artists tell stories and the way that we interpret the use of 1 point, 2 point, and 3 point perspective. Okay? 1 point perspective is commonly used in these areas. So if you write this down, you don't have to write it down right now. I'll have this demo up for you guys. But if you start thinking about this when you watch stories and you look at illustration and you look at storytelling, okay? 1 point perspective is used to convey power and importance. So whenever you're watching a movie that has a battle scene, whenever you're having something that displays a lot of power, like wealth or richness, okay? Whenever we're looking at empires like the Roman Empire or the Spartan Empire or battle scenes, okay? Any exterior shot is always going to be in 1 point perspective. Whenever we look at any religion or background, they're always centered and they're laid out in a very symmetrical format using 1 point perspective, okay? When we look at an important shot, what I mean by that, what would be an important shot? When we have the establishing shot of a movie, when we have a sequence and we're opening up the sequence and we are showing a location for the first time, that is usually going to be displayed in 1 point perspective, okay? And then the other part, which is sort of what we're doing in here, since this is a basic class on environment design, is that we're going to be using 1 point perspective on our first assignment in an informative view. What do I mean by informative? Well, there are times when we can just draw a basic frame, put a horizon line in the middle, a vanishing point in the middle, and we're just giving an informative view of what the city or the village looks like. But take that example and imagine if you were a board artist and you were having to storyboard out a child who's maybe 7 years old who just lost their parents from, let's say, bad guys in the forest who attacked, and the child's walking back into a medieval city. What would the point of view of the child look like as they were walking into the city? Do you see the difference? Because now we have to think about the eye level of the horizon line, the height of the child, and how they are walking into their world. We're responsible for displaying that in storyboard panels that make sense, okay? So these are the key areas, and I have some examples here to show you for movies, okay? So whenever you're watching a movie, this is from 300, okay, which I find some personal tie to since I am Greek and have this background and can trace lineage, 5 generations of all male going back into Greece, right? So when we look at the story of 300 and the story of the Spartans, right? Whenever we see a battle sequence where we see an army coming towards us, you're going to see that army in 1-point perspective, okay? All right, absolutely mandatory. Here's another shot. This is from Gladiator, okay? So again, same sort of principle here. Battle sequences, looking from behind, okay? We are a lot of times in battle sequences creating a line in the middle between either the protagonist or the antagonist characters and then displaying their points of view in the battle, but always in 1-point perspective. Opening scenes, right? So what's really common is after that scene is then to switch to like a 2-point shot, okay? That's important for you guys to understand, because if you're working as a production designer and you're having to design an environment, your first question should be, what is the story, the sequence that is required in this particular scene? You have to design around that. And if someone tells you, well, hey, you're going to be working on the scene, it's in a tundra location, tundra meaning mountains and snow, and it's going to be a battle scene, and you go out and start drawing that thing in 2-point perspective, there might be an issue there. You need to really think about that staging and planning and how it comes together. All right? So if we go back and look at multiple sequences that are offered in a variety of different movies, you're always going to be seeing these movies displaying 1-point shots, because 1-point perspective, remember I went through this a couple slides ago, battle, wealth, power, okay, always stays that way. For us, informative, right? Major attack scenes. So here we're switching over Brad Pitt in Troy, which isn't probably one of his best roles, but I don't know, I love Brad Pitt, but there's all opening sequence. We're on the beach and they're coming forward. They have their shields up. 1-point perspective shot. Okay. When we go back to Gladiator and we see Russell Crowe coming through in the very beginning, he's on his horse and he's being introduced into the scene. They've shifted a little bit for balance, okay, for compositional balance, but you're going to see Russell Crowe coming at you in a 1-point perspective shot. Immediately after this, they switch to a second point. So what is the thing that's happening here? At 1-point perspective, we have one dedicated horizon line. We always have one, but one main vanishing point in the middle. The VP in this shot is right about here. Do you see that? So if we follow that row of spikes, it goes right to about here. Okay? And then if we follow some of these other characters, you'll see things go right to about here. If we follow the top of that sign, it's going to about here. If we follow the bottom of that sign, it's going to here. Usually you'll notice in staging that where you're placing the character coming into a scene has a lot to deal with exactly where the vanishing point is, because the trace lines, which are the lines I'm referring to here with the spikes and the sign, are all leading back to the vanishing point, right? So as a board artist, if you stage your scenes correctly, you should consider placing your character somewhere in relationship to that vanishing point. You're going to have a better outcome, versus if the vanishing point being right here and I have Russell Crowe come in from over here and walk in this way, it's not going to have the same effect. That would be a bad choice, because I'm not adhering to where that vanishing point is in setting up part of the scene. Okay? As he enters the scene, he also exits the scene in the same manner. We see him go forward. We have it in here, in terms of staging and composition, look at how the line of spikes converges back and it actually touches the top of his head. Do you see that? That's a great technique of what I call directional lines, where you're using part and environment and you're moving the line back through to pull us to the focal point or the center of interest. And that's exactly what's taking place right here. Okay? All right? Right after this sequence, literally inside the movie, that's why it's one of my favorite movies to watch still, even though now it's old. Okay? Boom. We now get exposure to, the bad guys. Okay? We get to see what's going to happen between the protagonist and the antagonist. Okay? We look over here, and then we see this Germanic tribe, and they're pissed off. They're they're ready to attack. They just got fireballs launched at them, and here they are, dedicated 1 point. Right? Now, This is a totally different movie. Russell Crowe again. Robin Hood, okay, attacking off the shore, 1 point shot coming straight into you, okay. Battle sequence from Twilight. They're just about to go into battle. What are they in? 1 point perspective, right in front of you. Vanishing point, right smack dab in the middle. Okay. Braveheart, battle sequence, 1 point perspective, right in front of you. Okay. What movie is that? That's right. I put the wrong movie on there. That's okay. I was late when I put that together, and I was tired. Okay, but still, same principle. Do you see it happening? Okay. So here's Lord of the Rings, attack sequence. Whether you're leaving in the middle of the battle, about to start the battle, or the end of the battle, it always gets reframed back into 1 point. And this is the thing that drives me nuts. Is when I teach a class. And even when I was in the studios and I have a new layout artist that comes to work on a project, and they're like, everything they do is in 2 point. They're like, I hate 1 point. I'm like, why would you hate 1 point? It's an important part of storytelling. You have to know how to use it and when to use it to your advantage to tell a story. Okay? And then, of course, after this, another attack sequence, Avatar, right? 1 point, again, coming straight at us, running towards us. Okay? Back to Robin Hood again, 1 point. Okay? Now, important buildings. If you go back and look through art history, which is extremely important, and if you go back and look at the Egyptians, and the Egyptians did this very well, is they figured out how to display with symmetry important buildings and shapes. Part of that theory of laying things out on a symmetrical line where there's complete balance on both sides and equalness was a way that we still use to this day to convey things of importance and power, especially in government and in ruling countries or vice versa. I would love to, if I had the opportunity and there was another species on another planet, and if I could go and look at their Capitol building, I bet you it'd be laid out in 1 point perspective. Because it's just the way it would be laid out, it would just give it that impact of importance because it gets everything to be focused in the middle. So when we start looking at people of power, we start looking at rulers, okay? We start looking at presidents, okay? You're going to tend to see them in photos and when they're talking to you always in 1 point perspective, dead center in the screen. Why? Because that is conveying part of that power. If you go into the Oval Office, and if you look at the Oval Office, there's still a line down the middle, even though it's oval, and you have the president centered in front of you. If you were to go grab images of Putin talking, you're going to see him in 1 point. We don't want to show him in 2 point perspective because 2 point isn't used for that. It doesn't convey that to a viewer. Okay? So, again, back to the Roman Empire, back to Gladiator, an important scene. We need to show how massive this city is, how massive this empire is and what they've built. Okay, how do we see it? Right here, we have members of the Senate sitting there. They're waiting for the return, right, of the Roman emperor coming back from seeing Maximus on the battlefield. And this is how it's staged, right down the middle, perfect 1 point, okay? All right, other shots that we see, a reverse shot showing the troops coming back in, it's centered into 1 point, all right? Even when we switch to another scene, you remember the scene? This is where the emperor's son has come in and he's sort of taken power and he's talking to the Senate, but you see how it's set up? What is smack dab in the middle of the screen, okay, are the elements that represent and where the head of the Senate would be and where the staging is going to take place next. When we cut to, when we see him sitting there and he's spinning the sword, right? That's all staged back together and it's all set up. Now this is a setup where we're further away in an establishing shot, and they truck in a little bit and then they cut and boom, we see the emperor's son sitting there spinning the sword, which to me, I love that thought of him spinning it, of like deciding, it's like almost, of who he's going to kill next, and he's just sort of, it's like the old Russian, spin the, I don't want to say spin the bottle, but what's the, when you're playing Russian roulette, thank you, and you're sitting there and you're spinning the gun in a circle, right? He's doing the same thing with the sword, which is a great part of that scene. Okay, but the staging sets all that up, okay? Let's go to another movie. Boom. We jump back over. Remember that sequence in 300? When the character's sitting there and he's talking to all his people. Look at him up there. Look at him up high with his arms out. Okay, that is a one-point perspective shot. However, the camera is up high, and something we talk about quite a bit is where's the position of the horizon line. The horizon line is up high because we are looking down on top of everybody. Whenever you go into people of power, have you ever seen the Pope speak in Italy? Where is the Pope when he comes out to talk? A lot of times he's on the top, the upper echelon of like a 3 or 4 story building, and he's overlooking the crowd. He is elevated above. So what does that convey right there? People of power need to be elevated above other people. In fact, in part of your drawings in one-point perspective, if you go in there and if you take a building and elevate it up above the other buildings, it makes that building feel more important. In fact, if you go back and look at historical reference of castles, castles tend to be elevated above the rest of the common town folk and people. I wish we had more castles in the United States, but we don't. But if you ever have the chance to go over to parts of Europe, okay, and especially if you go look at German castles, Russian castles, right, you're going to see lots of beautiful, and there's even some really cool structures in part of the Muslim world that have been created the same way through Mesopotamia and other parts. You see these elevated buildings that are areas of importance, and then you come back and then you see things a little bit lower, and that is doing the same thing, okay? So when we look at these shots, it doesn't matter faith, background, because we can take a complete 360 degree turn and go over and look at a totally different culture, and they have the same principles working, okay? Taj Mahal, right? Historical importance. There's a historical story there about the history of the king and the queen, and look at the way it's laid out. Perfect symmetry, one-point perspective, power. Okay, there's a reason for those shots. All right? Jump over and we start looking at Chinese culture. Okay, totally different belief systems in terms of religion, which is fine. Same belief systems in the way that you display buildings of importance. Okay? Does that look familiar? Right? Look at how it's displayed. Completely with complete symmetry. It's totally symmetrical. All right? So, next, grouping. Grouping in silhouettes. Establishing a key group. The biggest mistake I have that students do when they start to do environment sketching is they scatter buildings all over. Well, the problem is, if they're all about, which they usually are, they're 1 inch in size, they all look the same and the eye doesn't know where to go. So what we have to do as artists is we have to start to consider grouping. And this is the hard thing about teaching environment sketching, is first I have to teach you how to think in terms of shape language. Then you have to learn a little bit about perspective. But then there's also the other side, which is design and composing. You're designing some of your buildings now to get more interesting silhouette shapes out of them, correct? Correct. At the same context, you're now going to have to start to think about grouping. When we take multiple, here's the problem. If you have a composition and you have 5 buildings that are all over and they're all the same size and the same thickness, the eye doesn't know where to go. So what we have to do is we have to group things together, and we could create areas of importance, okay? Also in grouping, you can group other things together and then have one thing be totally separate, and that will pop out. So here's an example of what I call positive grouping, where I bring multiple elements together. Mind you, 1-point perspective shot when you're seeing this scene inside Fury. Have you guys seen this movie, by the way? Watch this on surround sound, and the battle scenes make you like shake in your chair because you're like, your heart rate starts pumping when they're like shooting rounds back and forth. It's crazy, okay? So here's an example of the positive grouping, right? Here's an example when you go the opposite way on a negative grouping. All the soldiers around him are now one group, okay? And the head of Rome, okay? He's sitting there separate. You see that? He's not really in the group. He has a separate silhouette around him of the background. Okay, so that's the difference between a positive and a negative. That's what I tend to call it. Okay, so that's important to me because if I were to take 5 of you as students, put you against the wall, and if I wanted to make people look at one student, all I do is put that person in the middle, separate the other students, and your eye is going to go right to that individual every single time. Okay? This is about composing now. It's about understanding how and when to group items together. So I'll be talking about that as we go through the class. I sort of sneak up behind you and I start mentioning comments about grouping and arrangement and focal points. That has to deal with composing, okay? So I try to get you to think about your composing and what you're arranging, okay? Here's another sample for you, okay? So looking at this sequence right here, okay? What movie? Just want to make sure. Someone says something. So we look at this Mad Max, right? First of all, the shot's in one point. Okay. Second, do you see how this guy really doesn't have much around him? Do you see how white he is? Do you see how this guy and these characters blend into the side? So you have a left grouping, you have a right grouping, and you have him in the middle, offset, and he sort of pops out. Okay? Staging. All right, this is The Count of Monte Cristo, another fantastic movie to watch with a good story. It's a little bit older. There's a scene in this where the Count comes back. So imagine you're a board artist and you have to board out the sequence you get, the script, and the script indicates that when the Count makes his final appearance, he's going to come down in front of his party and he's going to come down and drop down in this balloon. This is a really important part of the story. Why? Because this is the Count finally returning and be exposed to his enemies as a different person, and nobody's ever seen that before. Does that make sense? So right there I said the key word, important. Once you hear important or importance, battle, war, wealth, religion, any of those things, your shot better be set up into one point, and that's exactly how they did it. Behind them you see his house. Down comes the balloon. These 2 guys standing right here, here and here, they go to open the door, and then out, and even better, he's sitting there inside. Then he stands up like, okay, I got to go deal with people now. And then he walks out, and he's coming right towards us in one-point perspective. It's a fantastic way to set up the scene, okay? Again, we go back to battle sequences, right? We go back to Mad Max, and we look at exactly how they're staging. And also notice, where's the most interesting silhouette shape right now in this image? It's right smack dab in the center. So that means your focal point and part of what you're looking at is right there, which means the other elements that are grouped become supporting elements in the composition. So a long time ago, I was really lucky to take some classes with Paul Felix, another guy named Jim Schlenker, and then my mentor, Michael Spooner, okay, and Robert St. Pierre. And I remember talking about groupings and reads. And here's another thing to consider. The human brain tends to work better with prime numbers, okay? For example, we tend to memorize things better in primes. We tend to look at things and be able to focus on things in primes. When we look at things in pairs, and in even numbers, we tend to mess them up. Okay? So prime language examples of numbers and compositions tend to dominate in art a lot. Okay? I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to start to sing the very beginning of a song that has a phone number in it. And you guys finish it. 8, 6. Keep going. It's an 80s song. 8, 6, 7. Louder. 5, 3, 0, 9. It's an 80s song, right? You remember that 8, 6, 7, 5, 3. You remember that 7-digit number. It's that easy. It always sticks in your brain. In fact, it's easy to remember numbers that way, right? It's primes. Okay? When you have individuals that are in 2s, 4s, and 6s, it's hard. When I try to memorize like my cousin's phone number in Greece, it's hard. It's always, a lot of European numbers are like 8s, and I'm like, oh, I hate 8s. I always forget the last digit, okay? Well, what I'm getting to is a lot of times in art, things grouped and oriented in primes, 1, 3s, 5s, and 7s, okay? Groupings in 3s are great for storytelling. Center group, the other 2 groups are supporting elements. Does that make sense? Groups of 3s. Quick, easy visual reads. And I remember once Paul Felix making comments about when you see something on the screen, Disney had done all these focus tests and tests that it's up there on the screen for like 2 to 3 seconds, and the person in the theater who's the non-artist, they have like 2 to 3 seconds to see what, and they go right to the visual reads. 1, 2, 3, done. That's it. So if you have more than 1, 2, 3, and too much stuff all over, I have a little analogy for that. I call that, if you have a building or a shape and I can draw a piece of yarn around it, like a line, and I could go around lots of elements like that, then stuff isn't anchored down and it's not grouped correctly. You need to have things become part of consistent groups, okay? All right? Again, back to Fury. As soon as they're into that attack sequence with the tank line and tanks hiding in the back, boom, right back to 1 point. Okay? Hagia Sophia, okay? One of 7 wonders of the world, okay? It used to be a Byzantine church back in the old days. It was an Orthodox church, and it was overtaken when Turkey took over that territory, and it's now a mosque. Okay, so it's funny. I show this to some of my students who've never been outside of the United States. They're all, "Is that from Star Wars?" I'm like, "No, it's an actual building." Okay, and now so I'm going to show you, looking at the exterior of it, what you'll notice is how it's designed so much around 1 point. Okay, and in fact, when we look at all these different faiths and bases, we go back into 1 point again. So if you look at the Catholic Church, okay, that's inside Hagia Sophia, and if you walk through parts of it, it's all set up, and it's all outlaid because it's something of real importance and power. Anytime we're getting close to God or someone who is a higher spiritual being, it's always going to be set up into 1 point, okay? Very wealthy people have their houses designed around 1 point, okay? Private mansions, you name it, all wealth, okay? Even this is still 1 point, even though you have a large structure on the side. That just creates a little bit of balance, just differentiates things a little bit, okay? Gardens. Rich people have so much money that they can have their own garden that you have to walk through. And they set it up into 1 point, of course, right? All right. So, how do you transfer all this into your art? Becoming a better artist doesn't just mean that you develop things by chance. It happens by developing approaches and strategies that you can apply to your work. Then over time, with knowledge, repetition, and application, it happens, okay? I call that, sometimes I call it CAR. K-A-R, knowledge, application, and repetition. You have to be able to, you just don't draw something once. You have to be able to repeat it. You have to do it in your design thinking. You have to be able to apply this into your compositional thinking, into your storytelling. Knowledge, application, repetition. You do that over and over, and you get better and better at what you're doing. All right? Here's a piece from Treasure Planet and from my friend, Michael Spooner, who was also my mentor for a couple years, right? Michael's a really fantastic designer. Okay, the reason, yes, sir.
Is that traditional or digital?
This is traditional. I'm actually teaching a class this semester called Sketching for Animators and Illustrators, Traditional Medium Techniques. We're going to be doing this technique right here. Okay? In fact, a lot of Michael's stuff is traditional. This is a great technique, which is, in case you're wondering, it's vellum and or tracing paper. This is a sheet of vellum, and it has Prismacolor pencil. Well, let me back up. Color erase pencil. Then on top of that, you come back with Prismacolor pencil. On top of that, you come back with a black pen to pull out lines. And then on top of that, you erase or come back with a little bit of gouache. 5 techniques. The reason why I wrote that class here at the school is because those are techniques I learned while working in animation. They're techniques that you need to learn to apply, not just traditionally, but then you learn that traditional technique and you can apply it digitally. Does that make sense? So if you know that structure and what goes where in a traditional medium, you know how to apply it digitally as well. Okay? But something else I'm going to throw at you right now. When transferring things into your art, Okay, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. Notice the distance and the separation between, and I haven't talked about this yet, it's something for you to think about after your horizon line is down, foreground, midground, and background. Okay? Those become huge in the way that we tell stories, in the way that we allocate depth to the viewer. If we don't have good foreground, midground, and background setup or separation of those three spatial planes, we lose distance inside a piece. Okay? Michael fully understands the importance of using perspective, when to use it, when to tell stories, and he's really good at that. So when he has an exterior establishing shot of an important location, you're going to see it in what perspective, folks? Back into 1 point. Okay? Absolutely. All right? All right, and this is just some other, I don't know whose art this was. This gentleman, it's that pronounced as, well, in Greek would be Ionis, which is John in English. So here it's Ian maybe, Dumitris, Russian or some type of a Czech background. I've never met him. I hope he doesn't mind me using his work. I try to give people credit. Beautiful work right here. Look at the supporting elements, right? This is in your genre, folks, of your assignment. That is medieval-based environments right there. You have buildings in the foreground, and then where do you go? Right into the background, and you have this really tall structure, which, where is the most important silhouette outline, by the way? Right in the middle around all this. See this? When you look at this piece, your eye comes in here and it sees the importance of that silhouette, which tells us to look there. And then next, your eyes start to come in and then see all this other beautiful little secondary detail that's down here. Absolutely fantastic work, okay? Done by a very knowledgeable artist who understands perspective, placement, overlap of shape, visual reads, okay? Here's another piece from the awesome Jamie Jones, who's another conceptual artist that works in the industry, right? Battle scene. What perspective is it in? It's 1 point. Has to be. It's a battle scene. And here are these guys coming out, and they're walking in to ready to engage. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but Jamie is great at staging. He's a total amazing pro, right? Even the angles of the knife blades and the angles of the spears are set up on intent to provide you with directional impact. If you want to learn more about that, you should be spending time taking a look at the American illustrators and some of the great masters, especially the American illustrators. Okay? Howard Pyle, N.C. Wyeth, Dean Cornwell, okay, play such a huge important part on the way that you learn how to design. I learned more being here when I was 18, studying from Marshall Vandriff and understanding, looking at the American illustrators, and I think I learned from everybody else. Taking the things on how they were applying directional lines, cues, foreground, midground, background into their scenes to tell stories, okay? Nice piece, right? And then we come over here. I believe that is a piece from Robrupal, who is another really talented artist who works inside the animation industry. He worked at Disney for a while. Now I believe he's one of the senior art directors over at Naughty Dog in Santa Monica. Okay, great piece, establishing shot of the city. Yes, that's 1 point perspective. It's starting to slide into 2 point. I'm going to show you where. So the vanishing point, if we follow that line, and that line is right here, correct? But what happens is we have this thing called the cone of vision. So a lot of times having the vanishing point right in the middle of the page becomes boring. So we want to slide it to the left or to the right to have a little bit more interest. When we do that, if we slide it to the left like we see here, what happens is that the right side of the image, parts of the lines get outside of the cone of vision, and those lines want to start to converge to another vanishing point because our angles of objects become acute and obtuse. Acute being less than 90 degrees and obtuse being greater than 90. So what happens is you see right here, those lines recede back to the VP, but these lines start to curve down and they are going to a secondary vanishing point. Because if Rob had these lines go straight across, you would then have an obtuse angle, and it starts to look too overwhelming in the drawing. So it's a little cheat we do sometimes where you start to curve some angles going back, and it starts to go to a secondary vanishing point. Even the buildings in the background here, situated over a little bit, that guy is converging to his own VP there, and then this one's going to another. So you sort of have an environment that's designed in one point with buildings now going to their own sets of vanishing points to make the composition enhanced. Nothing wrong with that, okay? I really like this piece of art. To be honest, I don't know who did this. I forget. It might be Sparth. I think it is. And it might be someone from Naughty Dog, but I found it. It's an amazing piece of art. And the one thing, I always like this expression that I heard when you give an assignment to a student, and I've always had some students go, oh man, that's boring. I don't know what to do. And they start complaining. And the expression is, it's not the assignment that's boring, it's you that is boring. If you cannot think of a good solution to your assignment, and you cannot think of medieval buildings and blocks, I don't like that, hum, right? You have to be able to go in and gather reference. We watched that video on Sergio Pavlos, right? What did he say? Gather reference, know your subject matter. It's the same thing we're already doing here. It's the same thing in all of good design. Good designers get reference, they know their subject matter, they think of stories, they think of ideas that make sense, that aren't too far out there on the left wing of the ADHD spectrum, and then they bring it all together, okay? Here's a great example of one-point perspective, overlapping of shapes and showing you depth. You have dedicated foreground, you have dedicated midground, and then you have dedicated background. All those come together, and that makes you efficient into environment design, is displaying that depth, all right? Speaking before, here's another piece of the amazing Sparth, okay, Nicolas Bouvier, amazing designer, went to Art Center, really good, developed with, I'm not going to say that, I don't know if he created it exactly, but I knew some other artists that were also using this, but he was really sort of the forefather of taking and applying graphic shapes that, to be honest, back in the, if you go look at propaganda posters that were designed back in World War I and II with German and Russian countries, right? They were using a lot of graphic shapes overlapping each other. He was able to take part of that mentality in Photoshop and apply those graphic shapes and elements as custom shapes, and then start creating foreground, midground, and background using shapes and textures with limited rendering. So you noticed what I said? Limited rendering, not having to go in there and render something forever, but going in there and using shapes, light side, dark side, overlap, to start to convey with a sense and direction of light. Is able to convey work really quickly, okay? Still, in a lot of his pieces, like the one in front of you, one-point perspective. Simple, easy shots, establishing, showing the, and transferring the abilities of understanding silhouettes, shape, language into a piece, okay? All right? I just, what I do sometimes is when I'm at home, if I'm bored on a Friday night, I'll go grab images, and I have a folder, I call it inspiration. I just throw it in there. I came across that. I thought it was a really good example of atmospheric perspective. It's a nice sort of one-point shot. There's a lot of depth in there. So I just, grabbed it and throw in that folder. All right? Here's another shot here. Forget who does this one, but again, nice one-point transition. We're going into one key shape, one large shape in the background. You see that? Okay? If you get stuck, your goal for your assignment now is to start taking your images that you have completed, okay, and to start mapping them out on a grid plane in perspective with items overlapping each other going back into depth, okay? So a couple things you might want to consider as you're drawing, which is, where's my focal point going to be? What building's going to be more important? It doesn't have to be a giant castle. It could be it could be a simple building where maybe one of the characters live in your story. So the other buildings would then be supportive, which means if they're supportive, they wouldn't have more detail or more silhouette language than would your primary building, okay? That's back to the principles of visual reads and what we see, okay? I believe this is, I'm trying to look on that. I think this is Fengzhu, okay? Another absolutely wonderful, super talented artist, beautiful work. So you'll notice Another 1 point perspective piece, an area with a giant blue stone that looks like the blue stone of power or whatever it is, right? It's an area of importance, 1 point shot. Okay? Okay. Another piece, spark, castle in the back, character for scale, people walking through, getting to location, huge. Okay. Another piece I liked, good transition, nice depth, nice feel. Okay. That's a piece I did, black and white tone, beginning, foreground, midground, background, taking you back. Okay. Sorry, that's a little pixelated, but that is one of the key shots to the Monster University film from Pixar, where we see the characters standing in front of the gateway and entranceway, which is of course in flat on 1 point, of the characters going inside their location. Okay, another great shot right there of them on campus, buildings coming through, 1 point, characters in the middle. All right, sorry that's pixelated. A guy I worked with for a little bit, Daniel Lopez Munoz, really talented designer. He's up at Pixar. He's one of their key designers. He did a lot of the designs here on Up. Super nice guy. He designed most of the key characters for Pixar. I love this shot. Simple, sort of 1 point. It's a little bit of an upshot, but low horizon line, but that's fine. Okay. So this is where we're talking about, look at the informative natures of these shots. The interior of a room, 1 point perspective. Okay. All right, I'm going to end this lecture here. We'll talk more about this later when we get into 2 point. I'll record it and I'll put it back up on YouTube for you. Because when we go into 2 point, now we're talking about something a little bit different. We're talking about transitions, swipes. We're talking about discovery of something new. We're talking about linear and organic movement inside a scene. Transition of scale of things getting larger and smaller, going through a journey, okay? More interesting angles, off kilter, 1 point perspective, which can sort of goes into 2 point. Talk about controversy, and then setting up balance. Okay, we'll get into that later. I'm going to go ahead and stop it right here. Any questions before we finish? Cool. I'm going to end it right here at 42 minutes. Thanks, guys.